The Xal'thar mothership loomed against the backdrop of Earth's blue and white marble, a massive construct of blackened steel and pulsating green energy. Its silhouette cast a shadow over the planet, surrounded by a fleet of warships that drifted silently in formation. Each vessel bristled with weaponry, their hulls scarred from battles fought across countless worlds. The Xal'thar were conquerors, their empire built on the ashes of those who dared to resist. But as they approached Earth, there was no sense of challenge, only opportunity. Commander Xylox stood on the bridge of the mothership, his posture rigid and his eyes fixed on the holographic display. The display projected Earth's surface, rotating slowly as scanners swept across continents and oceans. Information scrolled in alien script, geological surveys, population density, technological assessments, all of which painted a picture of a world that had yet to touch the stars. "Status report?" Xylox demanded, his voice a low growl that resonated through the cold metal of the command deck. Tactical Officer Brintak responded immediately, his fingers gliding over the translucent control interface. "All scans complete, Commander. No planetary shields detected. No orbital defense platforms. The planet's surface hosts rudimentary technology, basic firearms, non-militarized vehicles, and limited communications infrastructure. There is no sign of advanced weaponry or spacefaring capabilities." Xylox's mandibles clicked in what could have been a smirk. "Primitive. As expected. This world will fall swiftly." Science Advisor Viluin, whose robes draped over a thin, elongated frame, approached the console. His skin was pale, almost translucent, and his eyes were layered with a nictitating membrane that shimmered in the low light. "Their communications are unencrypted," he said, activating a stream of intercepted signals. The bridge filled with a cacophony of human sounds, laughter from a sitcom, the melody of a pop song, the dull monotone of news broadcasts. Xylox waved a hand, silencing the noise. "They celebrate while their doom approaches. Have they no concept of the dangers that lurk in the stars?" Viluin's fingers danced over the console, isolating specific signals. "Their global networks are filled with distractions. Entertainment, trivial discourse, and commerce. Their military channels, what few there are, show no signs of alert. They are blind to our presence." "Perfect." Xylox's voice held a note of satisfaction. "Prepare the drop pods. We will deploy to their population centers, show them the might of the Xal'thar Dominion, secure their leadership, neutralize resistance, and begin resource extraction protocols." Brintak hesitated, a rare show of caution. "Commander, should we not attempt communication first? Perhaps offer terms of surrender?" Xylox's mandibles tightened. "The Xal'thar do not negotiate with lesser species. They will serve or they will perish. We take what we need. It is the way of our kind." Brintak bowed his head, acknowledging the order. The command deck shifted into a flurry of activity. Screens displayed the deployment patterns: New York, London, Tokyo, Beijing, cities teeming with life, ripe for conquest. The Xal'thar fleet adjusted its position, drop ships aligning with their targets, engines humming as they charged. Viluin initiated a final scan of Earth's electromagnetic field, his gaze fixed on the data streams. "Commander, the planet's energy signature is unusual." Xylox glanced over, his expression hardening. "Explain." "The natural electromagnetic field is highly active. There are fluctuations, background radiation, geomagnetic anomalies. It is likely interference from the planet's core or its solar exposure. Nothing that poses a threat, but, Xylox prompted, his patience thin. "But it is unlike any world we have encountered before. The readings are inconsistent, as if the planet itself is alive." Xylox dismissed the notion with a flick of his hand. "Superstitions. The last remnants of a species grown old and complacent. Prepare the troops. We launch in 10 cycles." The bridge responded in unison, the crew's movements synchronized and efficient. The Xal'thar soldiers prepared their weapons, plasma rifles, energy blades, and containment devices. Their armor hissed as systems activated, a chorus of readiness. In the launch bays, Rows of drop pods stood ready, each a metallic coffin designed to pierce the atmosphere and deliver death to the surface. As the countdown began, Xylox allowed himself a moment of reflection. He had led invasions against fortified worlds, battled fleets in the cold void, and reduced empires to dust. Earth was nothing more than a stepping stone, a resource-rich world with a population too naive to defend itself. His legacy would be the assimilation of yet another planet into the Dominion's ever-growing expanse. The drop pods launched, streaking toward the planet like falling stars. They burned through the atmosphere, their descent marked by trails of fire. In the cities below, humans gazed upward, their expressions mixed with curiosity and confusion. They saw only the beauty of the lights in the sky, unaware that death was descending upon them. But as the first pods touched down, the confusion began. Communication systems faltered, radios hissed with static, and digital screens displayed nothing but white noise. The Xal'thar soldiers emerged from their pods, weapons primed, only to find empty streets and silent buildings. The cities, once bustling, seemed to hold their breath. And in the stillness, something moved. Shadows twisted where there should have been none. The soldier sensors blinked with error messages, detecting life forms that vanished upon a second scan. Their helmets filled with whispers, human voices, yet not. Laughter, weeping, the murmurs of conversation, as if the city itself was speaking. On the mothership, Xylox watched through the soldiers' visors. His confidence wavered, a thin crack in his iron demeanor. "What is happening down there?" he demanded. Veluan's hands trembled over his controls. "Commander, I am detecting temporal distortions, spatial anomalies. The energy signatures are intensifying." Brintak's voice came through the comms, strained and laced with static. We can't see them. The city is empty, but we are not alone. They are here, but not here. Permission to." The signal cut off. The screens on the bridge went dark, and for a moment, the only sound was the low hum of the ship's engines. Then, one by one, the screens came back online. But instead of tactical readouts, they displayed static. And within the static, faces began to form. Human faces, eyes wide, mouths moving in silent screams. Xylox felt a chill, a sensation foreign to his hardened soul. "Recall the troops," he ordered, his voice devoid of its former arrogance. "Pull them back. Now." But no one moved. The bridge crew stared at their consoles, their faces blank, their eyes reflecting nothing but the swirling patterns of static. And as the shadows deepened around them, Xylox realized the truth. The invasion had begun, but not in the way they had planned. And Earth was no mere world, it was a predator, and they had walked willingly into its jaws. The Xal'thar drop pods slammed into the concrete with the force of meteors, their impact craters sending shockwaves through the empty streets of New York, London, and Beijing. Steam hissed from the seams of the pods, and the hardened metal shells cracked open, releasing columns of cold mist. From within, Xal'thar soldiers emerged, tall, armored figures with angular helmets that glowed with a sinister green light. Their weapons hummed softly, plasma cores primed and ready to unleash devastation upon the unsuspecting human populace. But there was no populace. Sergeant Xal'thar, leading the assault team in New York, scanned the surroundings through his visor. His heads-up display, HUD, overlaid alien script onto the scenery, identifying objects and mapping terrain. The city that had, only moments ago, seemed vibrant and alive from orbit, now lay eerily silent. Abandoned vehicles sat motionless at intersections, their doors open, headlights still on. Digital billboards flashed advertisements to no one, their colors bright against the overcast sky. Paper cups and plastic bags rustled along the sidewalks, driven by a breeze that seemed too cold for the season. "Where are the humans?" Xal'thar muttered, his voice transmitted to his squad through encrypted comms. "Command, this is Beta Squad. We have landed successfully, but there is no sign of civilian presence. Awaiting further instructions." Static crackled in response. The usual clarity of their comms was replaced by a dissonant hum, punctuated by sharp clicks and whispers that might have been words. Xal'thar tapped the side of his helmet, recalibrating the frequency. Command, repeat. We are experiencing interference. Still nothing. His squad spread out, moving in a tight formation through Times Square. The massive screens overhead glowed with fragmented images. Faces that shifted too quickly to focus on. Text that dissolved into gibberish as soon as it was read. The soldiers advanced cautiously, their plasma rifles aimed at every shadow, every corner. "Sergeant, my sensors are glitching," Corporal Nareth said, her voice betraying a hint of unease. "I'm picking up life signs all around us, but there's nothing here." Xal'thar switched his visor to thermal imaging. The world turned into shades of green and blue, but the streets remained empty. Yet, every so often, a red shape would flare at the edge of his vision, always just out of focus, always gone when he turned to look directly. "Stay sharp," he ordered. "This might be an advanced cloaking technology. The humans may not be as primitive as we thought." Across the Atlantic, in London, similar scenes played out. The Xal'thar soldiers moved through Piccadilly Circus, their heavy footsteps echoing against the stone buildings. Double-decker buses sat idly, their windows cracked, doors hanging open. The soldiers approached a cafe, its tables set with half-eaten meals, coffee still steaming in porcelain cups. One soldier reached out, his armored glove brushing against the chair, still warm to the touch. "Where did they go?" he whispered, though his comms broadcast the question to the entire squad. A reply came, but not from his own kind. The voice was human, soft and filled with an echo, as if spoken from a great distance. "We are here. We've always been here." The soldiers snapped into defensive stances, weapons aimed at every direction. But the voice had no source, no body to target. Their sensors, designed to detect heat, motion, and energy, showed only static. One by one, the device readings flatlined, battery levels, health monitors, and weapon diagnostics all reduced to erratic lines of code. In Beijing, Captain Xylox led his team through the twisting alleys of the ancient city juxtaposed against neon-lit skyscrapers. His squad moved with precision, their steps synchronized, their weapons sweeping in arcs to cover every possible threat. But as they advanced, the city seemed to fold in on itself. The streets that had been straight now curved impossibly, leading them back to the same square they had crossed minutes ago. Buildings shifted in height and design. What was a market stall became a glass facade. What was a pedestrian bridge became an archway to nowhere. "Captain, I recognize this place," a soldier said, his voice tight. "We've passed the same fruit stand 3 times. Xylox activated his NAV mapper, but the holographic path only looped back on itself. "This is impossible. We are not moving in circles. Something is changing the environment." "Or changing us," the soldier muttered. Their visors began to display false information. Hearts beating within walls, thermal signatures buried under the pavement. The world fractured into mirrored images, each reflection slightly different, each showing the squad in distorted positions. One reflection showed the soldiers with human faces beneath their helmets, eyes wide and filled with fear. Another showed them as skeletons, hollow and still. "Stay together," Xylox commanded, but his squad was already fraying. Some moved ahead, others lagged behind, and a few stood still, their bodies frozen as if they had forgotten how to move. The air grew thick, oppressive, and sounds distorted. The crunch of glass underfoot became the wet squelch of flesh. The rustle of wind transformed into soft, mocking laughter. Back in New York, Xal'thar's squad reached Central Park. The greenery stood untouched, but the park felt wrong. The trees whispered, their leaves shivering without wind. Paths led into thickets that seemed to swallow the soldiers, turning clearings into mazes. Xal'thar's HUD blinked erratically, symbols and letters morphing into unfamiliar shapes. "Command, if you can hear me, we need immediate extraction," he called out. "This planet is wrong." But the only response was a voice that mimicked his own, repeating his words back to him, slightly distorted. "We need immediate extraction. This planet is wrong." Xal'thar turned, his visor fogged with his own breath. His squad was gone. The park stood empty, and the city beyond seemed to ripple like water. He felt a pressure in his mind, a presence that loomed over him without shape or sound. The shadows moved again, closer this time, their forms almost human but too tall, too thin, their faces smooth and blank. His plasma rifle fell from his grip. He tried to speak, but his voice had turned to static. His world narrowed, the trees bending inward, the sky folding down. And as darkness consumed him, the last thing he heard was a whisper, gentle and cold. "You should not have come." In the mothership above, the screens that had shown the soldiers' progress now displayed only static. Commander Xylox stared at the blank monitors, his claws digging into the metal railing. His fleet hung in orbit, engines silent, weapons inert. And all around him, shadows crept at the edges of vision, just beyond the light. The invasion had begun with confidence and strength. Now only silence remained, and the slow, creeping sense that they had stepped into a world not as it seemed, a world where reality itself was the enemy. The Xal'thar soldiers moved through the haunted streets of Earth's greatest cities, their once disciplined formation unraveling under the weight of the unknown. What began as a precise and calculated invasion had devolved into disarray. Their communications channels, usually crisp with orders and data, now only emitted distorted echoes. Human voices, twisted and broken, whispered through their helmets, too soft to understand, but too persistent to ignore. Sergeant Xal'thar had lost sight of his squad hours ago, if time still held meaning in this place. New York had become a maze of shifting architecture and false horizons. Buildings seemed to breathe, their windows like blinking eyes, and alleys twisted into dead ends where none had been before. Xal'thar's visor displayed erratic readings, heartbeats beneath concrete, thermal signatures high in the clouds, and occasional flashes of crimson that painted the empty streets with ghostly light. "Command, anyone respond?" he muttered, but his own voice came back to him, warped and hollow. His HUD showed green pings, life signs of his squadmates, but every time he turned to follow them, the path folded back on itself. He passed the same graffiti-splattered wall 3 times, the bright colors now smeared as if by unseen hands. In London, Corporal Narith crouched in an underground station, her plasma rifle aimed into the shadows. The cavernous tunnels echoed with distant sounds, the churning of metal on metal, the rush of wind through empty train cars, and the soft, wet sounds of something moving through water. She could see her squad's markers on her visor, but the tunnels led her in circles. Her flashlight beam cut through the dark, but the shadows swallowed it hungrily. "They're here. I know they're here," she whispered, her voice tight. Her fingers trembled against the trigger. The shadows shifted, forming shapes, figures with elongated limbs and eyes that glowed faintly, like embers. When she blinked, they were gone, but their presence lingered, pressing against her mind. Her sensors blinked. Life signs, dozens of them, approaching fast. She spun, weapon raised, but the tunnel stretched away into infinity. She ran, boots slapping against the damp stone, but the end of the tunnel always remained just out of reach. Her breath echoed back at her, louder and louder, until it wasn't her breath at all. In Beijing, Captain Vrulak found himself in a market square. The vibrant stalls and neon signs had dimmed, their colors washed out like an old photograph. His squad was gone, their last transmission a burst of static and screams. The square was empty, yet his sensors detected movement. His helmet's display overlaid red outlines of human figures, hundreds of them, standing in the open, staring. But when he looked with his own eyes, there was nothing. He switched to thermal imaging. The world turned into shades of blue and green, but where the outlines had been, now stood crimson shapes. They were human in form but wrong, too tall, too thin, their heads cocked at unnatural angles. They stood in perfect rows, unmoving, their bodies radiating cold instead of heat. "Identify yourselves," Vrulak shouted, his voice cracking through the comms. His visor displayed no response, no name, no rank, just error codes and blank screens. The figures began to move. Not with steps, but with glides, their feet never touching the ground. The air grew thick, each breath a struggle. Xal'thar fired. Plasma bolts tore through the square, shattering stone and glass. But the figures remained, untouched. His weapon hummed, overheated, and died in his hands. One of the figures stepped closer, its face a smooth, featureless mask. When it spoke, its voice slid under his skin, a sensation more than a sound. "You are lost. You should not be here." Xal'thar stumbled back, his limbs heavy. The square seemed to stretch, the walls bending like melted wax. His visor filled with error messages, symbols he did not recognize. His squad's life signs flickered, then extinguished one by one. Above the chaos, on the Xal'thar mothership, Commander Xylox watched through the fractured video feeds. His soldiers' visors displayed only fragmented images, streets folding into themselves, shadows dancing where light should be, and faces that shifted between human and alien. The crew around him stood at their consoles, but their eyes had lost focus, their movements sluggish. Tactical Officer Brintak, report, Xylox barked, but Brintak did not respond. His hands moved over the controls, but his screen showed only static. When Xylox approached, he saw that Brintak's visor reflected not the ship's interior, but a city street, one filled with shadows and ghostly figures.
Brintak.
Xylox seized his officer's shoulder, and Brintak turned. His eyes had become hollow, dark voids that leaked wisps of smoke. His mouth moved, but the words were not his own. "They are here, everywhere. They are us." Brintak's body convulsed, and his form shimmered, one moment Xal'thar, the next human. His face twisted through identities. An old man, a child, a woman laughing, a soldier crying, until his skin cracked and his body crumbled into ash. Xylox recoiled. Around him, his crew began to change. Their features blurred, their bodies becoming translucent. They moved as if in a dream, their voices overlapping in a rising chorus of fear and confusion. The ship's walls bent inward, the metal flowing like liquid, and the consoles oozed a dark substance that pulsed with life. On the surface, the Xal'thar soldiers vanished. One by one, their signals dropped off the grid. Cameras showed them walking into shadows, their bodies fading as if swallowed by the darkness itself. Their voices filled the comms, but they no longer spoke of their mission. They spoke of home, of loved ones, of memories that did not belong to them. Sergeant Xal'thar found himself in the middle of Times Square. The screens overhead displayed not advertisements, but his own face, twisted in terror. He heard his mother's voice, soft and familiar, calling his name. His helmet filled with static, and through it, he heard laughter, childlike and innocent. "We just wanted to play," the voice said. "But you came here, and now you're part of the game." Xal'thar sank to his knees. The city folded around him, the buildings closing in, and the sky above melted into an endless gray. His visor blinked its final message. Signal lost. Back on the mothership, the last of the video feeds died. The bridge lay empty, save for Commander Xylox, who stood alone among the shadows. His own reflection stared back at him from every surface, distorted, unfamiliar, and grinning. The ship hummed with a new life, a heartbeat that was not mechanical but organic, as if the metal itself had become flesh. And as the last light dimmed, the shadows closed in, their whispers blending into a lullaby. The Xal'thar had invaded Earth, but Earth had swallowed them whole. And somewhere, in the silence, a voice sang softly, "We are here. We've always been here." The Xal'thar invasion had become a ghost story. What began as a show of strength and dominance now devolved into a twisted nightmare, where reality itself seemed to conspire against the invaders. In the haunted remains of New York, London, and Beijing, the Xal'thar soldiers moved like shadows, lost, afraid, and hunted by an enemy they could not see. Commander Xylox sat rigidly in his command chair aboard the mothership, surrounded by the dim glow of malfunctioning consoles. The bridge, once a hub of precision and control, now felt like a tomb. His officers stood at their posts, their faces slack, eyes unfocused. Screens that should have displayed tactical data instead showed looping images. Empty streets, whispers of movement, and static laced with human laughter. Science advisor Viluin, Xylox barked, his voice a hoarse rasp. Explain these anomalies. Why are our soldiers not responding? Viluin turned slowly, his movements delayed as if the air had thickened around him. His translucent skin had taken on a pallor, his eyes clouded. The planet, it does not want us here. It is bending, reshaping. Our technology cannot see what is real. The commander's claws dug into the metal arms of his chair. Nonsense. Earth is a primitive world. Its inhabitants are nothing more than scattered tribes of undeveloped beings. This is some kind of trickery. Viluin's expression twisted, a smile too wide, his lips pulling back to reveal teeth that seemed sharper than before. It is no trick, Commander. We opened the door, and now they are coming through. The lights flickered. Shadows slithered along the walls, their forms stretching and contorting. The bridge crew murmured to themselves, their voices blending into a low chant. Xylox rose from his seat, his armor's servos whining, but even his movements felt sluggish, as if reality itself resisted him. On the surface, Sergeant Xal'thar stumbled through the warp streets of New York. His visor had failed, displaying only static interlaced with brief flashes of his own face. Pale, wide-eyed, and lost. The city around him bent and flowed. Buildings leaned inward, their windows like hollow eyes, and the roads rippled as if covered by dark water. "Squad, report," he whispered into his comms, though he knew no one would answer. His hands tightened around his plasma rifle, but the weapon felt wrong, too light, too warm. He looked down and saw that his rifle had become a bundle of wires and bones, its surface crawling with veins. He dropped it, recoiling, and the weapon melted into the pavement, leaving only a wet stain.
Xal'thar.
A voice called.
Soft. Familiar.
His mother's voice, though she had died years before he had left his homeworld. He turned, and the street behind him had changed. He stood in a kitchen, the walls draped with cloth and the air filled with the scent of boiling herbs. His mother stood at the stove, her back to him, her long robes swaying as if caught in a breeze. "No, this isn't real," he muttered, but his feet moved on their own, drawing him closer. His mother turned, her face a perfect memory, her eyes dark and bottomless. "Come home, Xal'thar," she said, her voice rippling like water. "You're not supposed to be here." He blinked, and the kitchen was gone. He stood in an alley, his hands empty, the shadows closing in. His squad lay around him, bodies twisted, their armor fused with the stone, their faces blank masks. The shadows reached out, their fingers cold, and as they touched him, he felt his mind slip away. In London, Corporal Nareth wandered through the fog that had swallowed the city. Her steps echoed against unseen walls, each sound returning with a delay that set her teeth on edge. Her sensors were useless, her HUD a kaleidoscope of shapes and colors that made no sense. She felt the weight of eyes upon her, but whenever she turned, the fog only deepened. She stumbled into Trafalgar Square, but the iconic statues were wrong. The lions stood on two legs, their stone bodies soft and pulsing, their eyes alive. The column in the center twisted into the sky, its surface reflecting not the city, but a field of stars, alien constellations that made her head spin. "They are not human," a voice whispered. She could not tell if it came from within her helmet or the world around her. "They are not flesh. They are the shadows between breaths, the spaces between thoughts." Shapes moved in the fog, humanoid, but their limbs too long, their movements too fluid. She fired her weapon, the plasma bolts carving through the mist, but when the fog cleared, she stood alone. Her own shadow stretched before her, splitting into 2, 3, a dozen figures that peeled away from her feet and stood, grinning. "No, no, stay back," she screamed, but the figures merged into the mist, their laughter high and brittle. She ran, But every step only led her deeper into the fog, until the world became a white void, and she was nothing but a shadow among shadows. Back on the mothership, Commander Xylox faced the unraveling of his own reality. The bridge crew had become still, their bodies draped over consoles, their eyes open but unseeing. The walls of the ship warped, the metal breathing, the lights pulsing in sync with a heartbeat he could not place. Xylox stood at the center of the bridge, his form flickering. His features shifted, one moment Xal'thar, the next human, then something else entirely, a shape without form, a suggestion of claws and eyes. "The planet warned us," he said, his voice layered with echoes. "It showed us its truth, but we did not listen. Now we are part of the dream." Xylox stumbled back, his foot catching on something soft. He looked down and saw his own shadow, writhing against the floor, its edges curling like smoke. "This is madness," he hissed. "We are Xal'thar. We do not fear shadows." "But you should," Xylox replied, his mouth stretching too wide. "Because here shadows are real, and they are hungry." The lights died. The darkness moved, swallowing consoles and bodies alike. Xylox fired his weapon, but the plasma bolts vanished into the black, devoured by nothingness. The walls closed in, and the last thing he saw was Xylox's face, no longer alien but a mirror of his own, smiling. On Earth, the cities remained empty, their streets still and quiet. The shadows retreated, slipping into alleys and under doorways, their task complete. And in the silence, the planet breathed, an exhalation of mist and whispers, a reminder that Earth was not a victim, but a guardian, a place where reality bent to protect itself, and where those who trespassed became part of the story, lost between the pages, never to be seen again. The Xal'thar mothership hung in Earth's orbit, a silent leviathan against the endless black of space. But within its cold metal corridors, reality had begun to unravel. What once were straight, sterile hallways now twisted upon themselves. Lights flickered, casting shadows that moved independently of their sources. The ship's hum had turned into a low, rhythmic pulse, like the heartbeat of some slumbering beast. Commander Xylox wandered the bridge, his footsteps echoing strangely. The once vibrant crew sat motionless at their stations, their bodies stiff, skin ashen. Their eyes stared forward, unblinking, as if the life within had been replaced by something hollow. Xylox's own reflection in the darkened console screens seemed to shift, his face elongating, eyes darkening, mouth twisting into a smile he did not feel. "Report," he commanded, but only silence answered. His voice felt dampened, swallowed by the air. He approached Tactical Officer Brintak, whose fingers were still poised over the controls. When Xylox touched his shoulder, Brintak's body crumbled into dust, his uniform collapsing into an empty shell. Xylox recoiled, his hand coated in ash, the particles swirling in the stale air. On the surface, the soldiers fared no better. In New York, Sergeant Cathor moved through a city that defied understanding. Buildings floated above the streets, their foundations trailing mist. Streets led nowhere, curving back into themselves. He saw reflections in glass windows, not of himself, but of human families, sitting at tables, laughing, oblivious to the alien presence among them. He pressed his back against a wall, his breath fogging his visor. "Command, this is Cathor, requesting immediate extraction. Reality is bending. Nothing is as it seems." But his comms emitted only static. His HUD displayed his squad's vitals, but the signals were wrong, heart rates that spiked and plummeted, brainwave patterns that resembled not living beings but machines in a loop. His map showed his position as everywhere and nowhere, a blinking dot lost in a labyrinth of shifting coordinates. A figure moved at the edge of his vision. He raised his plasma rifle, the weapon feeling heavier than before, its metal warm and pulsing. The figure was human. A woman in a red dress, her bare feet silent against the wet pavement. She turned slowly, her face obscured by shadows, though the streetlights shone directly upon her. "Stay back," Cathor shouted. "Identify yourself." She did not respond. Instead, she lifted a hand, her fingers curling, and the world around him distorted. The buildings stretched like melted wax, the street beneath his feet rippling like water. His vision blurred, and his HUD filled with error messages. His squad's signals vanished, replaced by a single line of text. "You are not real." His helmet tightened around his head, the metal pressing against his skull. He tore it off, gasping, and found himself standing not in a city but in a room. The walls were white, padded. His hands were bound, his body wrapped in a simple gown. He looked down at his reflection in the polished floor. Human eyes, human skin, a face he did not recognize. No, this isn't me," he whispered. But the world did not change. The city, the invasion, his identity, all fragments of a dream, slipping away. Nurses entered, their faces soft with pity, and led him back to his bed, their voices soothing but devoid of meaning. In London, Corporal Nareth had fallen into a loop. She walked through a market square, past faceless crowds, their bodies like smudges of charcoal against a watercolor sky. She passed a fountain, its water running red, and turned a corner, only to find herself back at the market square, the same faceless figures, the same red water. She tried to speak, but her voice came out in reverse, the words unraveling in the air. She grabbed a passerby, her fingers sinking into his arm as if he were made of clay. His face turned to hers, his features soft and malleable, his eyes glassy. "Help me," she tried to say, but her lips moved on their own, and the words that came out were not her own. "You are part of us now." Her body betrayed her, moving through the square on a loop, her consciousness sinking into the rhythm of the crowd. She became one of the shadows, a smudge among smudges, her identity a thin thread that slowly frayed until only the loop remained. On the mothership, Xylox stumbled into the main laboratory. The science stations were covered in frost, their screens cracked, the glass beneath layered with frost patterns that resembled neural networks. He saw shadows moving behind the glass, figures in lab coats, their movements jerky, their forms translucent. "Viluin," he called, his voice echoing. "Where are you? What is happening?" The shadows coalesced into a single figure. Science advisor Viluin stood on the other side of the glass, his face a shifting mask of emotions. Fear, joy, anger, sorrow, all cycling too fast to follow. His body shimmered, and the glass between them seemed to melt away. "Commander," Villain said, his voice layered with echoes. "We reached too far. The planet, it is not just a world. It is a mind, a will, and we are nothing but thoughts within it." "Nonsense," Xylox growled. "You are infected by this madness. I will call for reinforcements. We will burn this planet clean." Viluin's face twisted into a human visage, an old man with kind eyes, then a young girl with a knowing smile, then a creature of light and shadow. "There is no fleet, Xylox. There never was. This ship, this invasion, it is a story, and you are only a character within it." The laboratory dissolved around them. The ship's walls turned to mist, the metal softened into flesh, and the consoles became veins and nerves. Xylox felt the floor give way beneath him, and he fell not through space, but through memories. He saw his homeworld, his rise to power, battles fought, victories won. But each memory cracked, revealing nothing beneath but darkness. He landed on soft ground. Grass brushed his skin, and he stood in a field beneath a sky filled with unfamiliar stars. The mothership was gone. The war was gone. He was human now, his alien body nothing more than a costume discarded at the edge of a dream. A voice whispered through the wind, gentle and eternal. "Rest now. You are part of us. You have always been part of us." And as Commander Xylox lay back against the cool earth, he felt the world fold over him, the fabric of reality knitting itself back together. He became part of the story, his identity woven into the tapestry of Earth's quiet defense. His invasion had never been, his army never real, and Earth remained as it always had, silent, watchful, and dreaming. The remnants of the Xal'thar fleet floated in orbit, their once mighty warships now nothing more than drifting husks. The mothership, which had been the heart of the invasion, pulsed with a sickly green light, its hull warped and twisted as if melted by an unseen force. Inside, corridors looped into themselves, rooms led to nowhere, and the few remaining crew wandered aimlessly, their minds fractured by the unraveling of reality. Commander Xylox, or what remained of him, stood on the bridge. His form had become translucent, his edges blurred, as if he were more shadow than flesh. His once vibrant armor was dull, the insignias of the Xal'thar Dominion peeling away like old paint. His eyes, hollow and dark, stared through the main viewport at Earth, a planet that remained disturbingly serene beneath the veil of clouds. "We must escape," he murmured, though his voice lacked conviction. The bridge was empty. His officers had faded into the walls, their bodies merging with the ship. He could still hear their whispers, a soft chorus of confusion and regret, echoing through the metal and glass. Desperation clawed at him. He reached for the control console, but his hand passed through it, the screen rippling like water. His own reflection stared back, no longer Xal'thar, but human. A face he did not recognize, yet felt intimately familiar. His lips moved on their own, speaking words he did not understand. "Help me." In the remains of New York, Sergeant Xal'thar moved through a world turned to ash. The buildings had crumbled, the streets were dust, and the sky hung low, a sheet of gray that pressed against the earth. His armor had fused to his skin, his weapons had become brittle, and every step he took left footprints that faded immediately behind him. He found himself in Central Park, though the greenery was gone. The trees were twisted metal, the grass a carpet of shattered glass. He heard voices, his squad mates, his commanders, his own voice calling out orders. But when he turned, he saw only shadows, shapes that flickered and vanished in the periphery of his vision. "Command, respond," he whispered into his comms, though they had been silent for hours. His HUD displayed only static, the green overlays now a sickly yellow. He felt his strength waning, his form becoming lighter, as if the world itself were forgetting him. The shadows gathered around him. They took shape, figures with human faces, but their eyes were too large, their smiles too wide. They moved without sound, their feet never touching the ground. Xal'thar fell to his knees, his hands sinking into the glassy earth. The figures knelt with him, their movements perfectly synchronized. "You do not belong here," they said, their voices blending into a single tone. "This world is not yours to take." "But my mission," he mumbled, his thoughts unraveling. "We came to." "Your story ends here," the figures said. "Become part of the dream." His vision faded, and as darkness claimed him, he felt his body dissolve, his mind slipping into the stream of whispers. He became a part of the shadow, a voice among voices, his identity nothing more than an echo. In Beijing, Captain Xylox had managed to gather the last of his soldiers. Only a handful remained, their eyes hollow, their bodies gaunt. They moved through the empty streets, guided by a sense of urgency they could not explain. The city had become a maze, walls shifting, roads curling back into themselves. They had no map, no destination, only the instinct to keep moving. "The extraction point is ahead," Xylox rasped, though his voice felt alien in his throat. His helmet had cracked, his visor smeared with ash. His rifle had grown cold, the plasma cell empty. He led his squad through an alley, but when they emerged, they stood in the same square they had left minutes ago. One of his soldiers began to cry, the sound thin and broken. "We're not getting out, are we?" Xylox wanted to shout, to rally them, but he had nothing left. The truth hung in the air, heavy and unspoken. They were lost not just in the city, but in reality itself. The world had twisted, and they were caught in the fold. Figures emerged from the mist, humans but not. Their faces were perfect, their expressions serene. They walked among the soldiers, touching them lightly on the shoulders. Each touch drew a sigh, and the soldiers sank to the ground, their bodies crumbling into mist. Xylox stood alone, his squad gone, the world silent. A woman stepped forward. She wore a simple dress, her hair long and dark, her eyes pools of shadow. "You should not have come," she said, her voice soft but final. "I was only following orders," Xylox said, but the words felt hollow. His hands were empty, his armor rusting away. "We were conquerors." The woman smiled, a gentle curve of her lips. "You were dreamers, but this dream is not yours. It is time to wake up." The world around him collapsed. The buildings folded inward, the sky peeled away, and the ground beneath his feet dissolved. He fell through layers of reality, each thinner than the last, until there was nothing but light. His body faded, his mind quieted, and he became a thought, an echo, lost in the fabric of Earth's defense. On the mothership, Xylox watched the last of his fleet disappear from the scanners. The screens displayed only a blue planet, its clouds swirling in peaceful patterns. The whispers had grown silent, the shadows had withdrawn. He was the last. "Escape," he muttered, his voice a dry whisper. "I must escape." But there was no escape. His form had become translucent, his body more thought than matter. The ship hummed with a new life, its systems absorbed into the world below. The consoles displayed not data, but scenes of life, human life, children playing, families gathering, cities bustling with ordinary routines. Xylox reached out, his hand passing through the screen. His reflection stared back. Human, tired, eyes filled with fear. His voice, when it came, was not his own. "You are part of us now," it said. "Become the dream." And with that, the last of the Xal'thar invasion vanished. Earth remained as it always had, serene, unyielding, and ancient. The galaxy would never know what had happened. The Xal'thar would become a cautionary tale, a myth of those who reached too far into the unknown. And beneath the quiet surface of the world, in the shadows of forests, in the echoes of empty halls, the voices of the Xal'thar lingered, whispers in the wind, shadows at twilight. Part of the dream, forever woven into the fabric of a planet that did not just defend itself but absorbed those who sought to conquer it. The Xal'thar invasion had become a whisper, a faint echo lost in the vastness of the universe. Where once a mighty fleet had hovered, only debris remained, orbiting Earth as silent reminders of the folly of conquest. The ships were empty shells, their metal twisted into organic shapes, hulls grown over with vines that shimmered with soft bioluminescence. Earth had absorbed them as it had absorbed everything that sought to harm it. Commander Xylox sat at the center of the mothership's bridge, or what remained of it. The consoles had become overgrown with tendrils of light, their surfaces warm and pulsing like skin. His own form had faded, translucent and fragile, a ghost tethered to the last vestige of his reality. His armor had crumbled away, revealing not Xal'thar flesh, but human skin, soft, pale, and unfamiliar. He stared at his reflection in the glass of the viewport. The face looking back was not his own. It was human. Brown eyes wide with fear, lips dry and cracked, hair matted and unkempt. He touched his cheek, and the reflection mimicked him, but the sensation was muted, as if his skin were not fully real. "I am Commander Xylox," he whispered, but even his name felt wrong, like an echo from a forgotten dream. A soft voice responded, not through the ship's speakers but within his mind. "Names are fleeting here. You are part of us now." He turned, but the bridge was empty. His crew had become shadows, their forms blended into the walls, their whispers nothing more than the hum of the ship. The vessel itself had become an extension of Earth, a biomechanical anomaly, neither metal nor stone, breathing in rhythm with the planet below. "Where are my soldiers?" he demanded, but his voice lacked strength. "They have joined the dream," the voice said. "As you will." The ship's viewport, which had shown only the cold expanse of space, began to change. The glass rippled, and scenes unfolded. Human lives, simple and serene. A young girl playing in a sunlit park, an elderly couple walking along a beach, a family gathered around a dinner table. Each scene felt intimate, real, as if he were not just watching but living within them. "These are not my memories," he said. But as he spoke, the scenes shifted. He saw Xal'thar soldiers, but their forms were soft, their faces human. They moved through Earth's cities, but the cities were alive. Buildings growing like trees, streets flowing like rivers. The invaders had become part of the world, absorbed into its ecosystem, their purpose rewritten. In the streets of New York, where alien weapons had once hummed with lethal energy, there was now only quiet. The skyscrapers had intertwined with forests, their glass windows filled with birds. The shadows that had hunted the soldiers had settled, becoming part of the scenery, indistinct from the breeze and the rustling of leaves. Sergeant Xal'thar was there, but not as he had been. His armored form had dissolved, and now he stood among the trees, a park ranger in a green uniform. His eyes, once sharp and alien, were warm and human. He guided children along trails, his voice gentle, his past forgotten. He was not a soldier but a caretaker, his story rewritten by Earth's dream. In London, Corporal Nareth had become part of the fog. She moved through the mist, her form barely visible, a spirit among the living. People walked past her, their faces peaceful, their conversations light. She was a guide for the lost, a whisper that led the way, her presence a comfort rather than a threat. The city had taken her in, her identity blurred but her purpose clear. Captain Vrulak had found a different fate. He stood on a quiet hillside in Beijing, his body aged, his features human. He painted the landscape, his brush capturing the blend of natural beauty and urban life. He did not remember his past battles, his mind free of the weight of conquest. He was an artist now, his canvas a celebration of life, his hands creating rather than destroying. On the mothership, Commander Xylox felt the pull of the dream. The walls around him pulsed, the floor softened, and the ship exhaled a warm breath. The console screens displayed scenes of Earth, children laughing, rivers flowing, mountains standing resolute against the sky. His war was over not with defeat, but with assimilation. He had not lost. He had been transformed. "You cannot keep me here," he whispered, though the words felt like a lie. "We do not keep you," the voice replied. "We embrace you. You were never an invader. You were always part of us." His body began to fade, his edges blurring into light. The bridge dissolved, its metal turning to earth, its circuits to roots. He stood in a field, the grass cool beneath his feet, the sky a perfect blue. Around him, people moved, humans, Xal'thar, and beings beyond understanding, all woven into the tapestry of Earth's reality. A young girl approached him. Her eyes were golden, her expression calm. "Are you lost?" she asked. I don't know," he replied, the last of his form dissipating. She took his hand, and he felt warmth, real and grounding. "Come with me. There's always a place for those who wander." Together, they walked into the light, his consciousness slipping into the stream of the dream. He became a part of the world, a story, a memory, a dream within a dream. Earth had absorbed him, as it had absorbed all who sought to challenge it. Not as a prisoner, but as a keeper of its secrets, a voice among many, echoing in the wind. Above, the debris of the Xal'thar fleet continued to orbit, a ring of dust and light circling the planet. To the rest of the galaxy, Earth remained a quiet, unremarkable world, a blue dot in the void. But to those who could see beyond the veil, it was clear Earth was not just a planet but a living, dreaming entity, a guardian of its own reality. And in the soft rustle of leaves, in the gentle crash of waves, in the quiet moments between breaths, the voices of the dreamers could still be heard, telling their stories, living their lives, and welcoming all who came with open minds and quiet hearts.